Last month, I came very, very close to losing my life. I went down to hang out with some of my closest friends and celebrate the 40th birthday of one of my oldest and dearest friends. We were staying near Virginia Beach and had been regularly enjoying the private beach that we had access to there. On my friend Raheem's birthday, we didn't know it, but lifeguards on nearby public beaches had declared early that morning that the waves were far too dangerous for anyone to go into the water that day. Most of my friends there had grown up around there and are much more experienced swimmers than I am. The water initially was deceptively calm, but kicked up quite a bit. People that were in a position to know better than me later said that I got sucked out about 150 yards from shore. I couldn't float, the waves were too violent, and every time I got knocked vertical, I'd get sucked out further. One of my friends tried to come out and save me, but he couldn't. I was too far out, and the water was too rough for him to make any headway. I was very, very close to giving up. As I kind of started to make peace with that and what was happening, I felt this kind of odd churning in my body. Things got weirdly silent, and it actually felt as if there was a light opening up above me. I had the distinct feeling my spirit was preparing to leave my body. I got really calm, which didn't make conventional sense at all, given the situation. We're here to talk about anomalous experiences in the phenomenon. What I just described would sound to some like an anomalous experience, and many others would recognize it as probably the most common experience we have as humans, something we all share in the end. The experience of our physical bodies passing away. As much as we sometimes don't want to admit it, some of these seemingly anomalous experiences are, in fact, universal. So there I was, oddly calm, the light coming down, and I'd already had these thoughts of my friends, my family, my partner. And then, this is true, I thought about the experiencer group. And I'm serious, I thought about this event today. And I realized, and I know this sounds wild, I realized that nobody knew my fucking passwords. Nobody. Not James, not my partner, not my own mother, nobody. Everything would be screwed. I couldn't die. Just after thinking that, I'm dead serious. Out of the corner of my eye, far off in the distance, I saw a surfer paddling out on his board to save me. He and the 911 response crew ended up saving my life that day. One of the response team, trained specifically to do this, couldn't even make it out to us. I'm very lucky to be alive. So I want to thank them, and I want to thank all of the special characters in my passwords. I also want to thank all of you special characters out here that joined us in person and on the live stream. It means the world to me and everybody else involved in putting this together. I also want to thank my co-hosts and especially the brilliant speakers that inspire us and why we're all here today. That brings me to our first speaker, Dr. Sharon Esbjörn-Hargens. Sean is a brilliant teacher, writer, and thought leader. I've been a student of his for about 2 years now, and it's amazing to think how much he's helped me develop within this field. His paper, Our Wild Cosmos, with its fantastic taxonomy of non-human intelligence, really should be read by anyone, I think, deeply invested in this field. Among many other things, he's the person that taught me to actually look at the history of fairy lore with new eyes and a thoughtful mind. Because as he so often says, with all of anomalous study, we can and should take it seriously and hold it lightly. Won't you please help me welcome Dr. Sharon Esbjörn-Hargens.
Thanks, Jay, for such a heartfelt welcome and introduction. And I'm so touched by your story. Really felt moved by that. It's great to be here with you all. I've gotten to connect with so many people I haven't seen for a long time or have never met in person, and look forward to making new friends and connecting with you throughout the day and in the evening. I'm very excited for our talk today and kind of kicking things off. There we go. So it feels like any self-respecting event that's focused on anomalous experience has to start with near-death experiences. And Jay, you actually really kicked it off in a pretty intimate way with that regard. But I also want to start my talk with near-death experience in a more kind of composite sense, kind of describing what seems to be all too common in the field of anomalous experience. So if you imagine a 20-year-old woman having a near-death experience, and then within the next few weeks after coming through that process, she has the experience of seeing some dead people in her house, out and about, and she's wondering, what's going on? Like, why am I all of a sudden seeing people who have passed away? Basically seeing ghosts. Then a month later, she has a UFO sighting. And she's thinking, oh man, why all these weird things are happening to me now, right? Then about 6 months later, she starts having poltergeist activity in her house. And things are moving around, there's weird sounds, and she's just feeling like kind of her whole life is in some sense different than it was before the near-death experience. And she's seeing things, hearing things, and just seems to be part of a whole different world than she was before. Then about 6 months later, she has her first Bigfoot sighting, right? She's driving to work along some country roads, and holy smokes, I think I just saw Bigfoot run across the road. And she's just going, man, my life is so different now. Like, I just don't even know how to make sense of all of this. Then she starts seeing little fairy beans in the backyard. And she's just going, wow, like I am going crazy, right? And then, within a year of that near-death experience, she actually has her first experience of interacting with what she feels are some kind of extraterrestrial or extra-dimensional beings in her house, right? So what's going on with this paranormal party, right? Like, why are all these different weird experiences happening, right? And this kind of scenario is a lot more common than we realize. There are a lot of experiencers who have a wide range of experiences that are quite out of the ordinary, and they often start to occur after some kind of trigger event. And so as I began reading the literature a number of years ago, and kept coming across examples like this one that I just presented, I just got so interested, like, what is this? Like, why is reality such that these kinds of experiences are happening? And why do some people only have some of these experiences and others have a few more of these experiences, these different kinds and categories of experience, and yet others seem to have the full range of these experiences? And so I've come to the sense that our subtle bodies and their associated inner senses have something to do with that. So my talk today is kind of exploring some different aspects of that and how we might consider the ways in which our embodied being energetically is involved with our perceptions and experiences of anomalous phenomenon. J Kripal refers to this paranormal party as the wastebasket problem, right? Because all these things just get thrown into the same bucket and no one knows what to do with it, right? You just, and it's like, is it related? Is it unrelated? And you just kind of like chuck it out because it's just the high strangeness factor is just too much. So you just end up walking away from it. Well, I want to go through the wastebasket, right? I want to pull it all out, look at it, try and understand how is it related, what's going on here. So my talk is essentially about meta theory meeting weird, right? And by meta theory, I'm referring to big models of reality that try and explain all of its dimensions. And this has been my background. For the last 20 plus years, I've been studying meta theory, integrative meta theories, and applying them to a wide range of areas: ecology, education, philosophy, and business. And so I'm always looking at how do we study a lot of different domains and then bring that to bear in order to better understand a specific area that you're interested in, right? And like, how do we integrate these different perspectives, disciplines, approaches? And so over the last 20-some years, I've been microdosing anomalous experiences. And by that I mean I'm an experiencer, but not in the typical sense. Like, I haven't had big, full-blown experiences that are just like, holy smokes. But I've had a lot of little experiences across the spectrum of weirdness that accumulatively have led me to feel like, wow, we live in a very dynamic and wild cosmos, right? And so I've gotten more interested in how might I apply my academic and professional background and integrative meta theories to this domain of anomalous experience. So a few years ago, I began creating what I refer to as exo-studies, which I sometimes summarize as we live in a big, weird universe, what I call a wild cosmos, and it's heavily populated with intelligence and intelligent beings, right? So I define exo-studies in a more kind of academic sense as an emerging integrative metafield committed to exploring the psychological, sociological, and scientific implications of living in a multidimensional multiverse. Now, there's a wastebasket problem. You can pretty much fit everything into that, right? It kind of covers it all. But that's the nature of my passion and my mind and my soul is I'm interested in grappling with these kind of larger scale considerations of how do we make sense of all of this. Exo-studies focuses on three main areas: multidimensional awareness, in particular our subtle bodies and our subtle senses and how those allow us to have subtle experiences. What I refer to as galactic posthumanism, or drawing from J Kripal's recent book, Superhumanities, superhumanism. Basically an expanded sense of what it means to be human, in part in the sense that we're not alone, and an expanded sense of galactic family, right? We live in, as I said, a highly populated multidimensional multiverse with lots of different kinds of non-human and what I refer to as alternate human intelligences, right? And then lastly, there's a focus on integrative metascience, right? So how do we develop a form of science that can investigate this, not in a reductive sense, in a holistic, dynamic, integrative sense, and what would that look like? Jay mentioned in his opening remarks introducing me that a couple years ago I wrote this article, about 50 pages, called Our Wild Cosmos. This was my first attempt to bring my kind of meta theory background to bear on anomalous experience and start to write about how we might think about anomalous experience, and in particular non-human intelligences, in a larger integrative way. I'm currently working on actually 3 books that I've been working on for the last 2 years. One that's called What's Up with UFOs? The Smart Person's Guide to UFOs, ETs, and the Multiverse. This is kind of a top 10 list popular book. Then the Advanced Exo-Studies book, a meta-integrative approach to extraordinary experience and anomalous realities. This really showcases 12 core concepts that I think can really transform UFO studies, and I'll be going through those in a moment. And then lastly, Our Wild Cosmos, kind of an expanded version of the article, living in a multidimensional multiverse populated with a variety of intelligent beings. And this presents a new cosmology of consciousness and contact, right? So those 12 concepts, I want to go through these briefly because this will give you a sense of what exo-studies is trying to do, and it also set a context for zeroing in on the topic of subtle bodies and anomalous experience. So one of the core concepts is metadisciplinarity, right? So including 150 plus disciplines, fields, and domains on various topics from the academic and philosophical literature, as well as UFO and space studies, and esoteric and paranormal studies, right? So really drawing on all of that in order to help us understand how we can think about this, how we can validate and verify it, how we can better, engage our own process of contact with these realities. Then the whole concept of our wild cosmos I've mentioned. A full table refers to the fact that there are over 25 viable hypotheses as to who, what, and where these non-human intelligences or galactic human intelligences are, whether we're thinking of them as extraterrestrial, extra-dimensional, crypto-terrestrial, time travelers, ultra-terrestrial, breakaway civilization, artificial intelligence, demonic, control system, and so forth. There's 25 different kind of ideas or hypotheses or theories as to what are we dealing with here, right? And I think all of them need to be put on the table and considered. So a full table is this notion of let's just put it all on the table and then really just see kind of what emerges as we continue to engage and study and explore the phenomenon. Then taking things serious and holding them lightly. Jay also mentioned this as kind of a mantra of mine as we approach all of this. And this includes the practice of ontological generosity, right? Leading with a generous sense of what's real, right? Opposed to a skeptical sense, right? It doesn't mean we don't bring in the skeptical element and critical thinking, but we start from a place of ontological generosity. Because I think the world is much more wild than we often give it credit for. And then epistemological reflexivity, so just reflecting on your own biases, worldviews, values, tendencies, and then methodological pluralism, using a lot of different methods to explore and understand this phenomenon, right? So all of that contributes to our ability to take all of this very seriously, but also to hold it very lightly. Doubleness is another concept I've been developing, and part inspired out of the work of J Kripal. He talks about this in his own way in a number of his books. But essentially, it's the fact that the phenomenon is inherently multivalent and self-erasing, in part because it transcends our established categories of consensus reality and thus often displays two or more seemingly contradictory qualities at the same time. So it's both subject and object, it's self and other, it's past and future, it's real and unreal, there's trauma and transcendence, there's experiential elements and empirical elements, inside, outside, symbolic and scientific, and so forth, right? Like there's just this dynamic doubleness that just seems to show up with the phenomenon over and over again. And then there's this notion of wild being. Wild being is the recognition that reality is multiple, it's withdrawn, meaning it doesn't always reveal itself fully to us. There's always aspects of it that are outside the horizon of our cognition or knowing. It's fluid, it's participatory, so we're in a deep dialogue with being and reality in these contexts. It's ontologically weird, meaning it's not just weird because we're seeing something we don't understand. It's just weird at a basic foundational level of its ontological realness. Like it's just inherently weird, right? And then it's indeterminate and it's enacted, meaning again, kind of this participatory aspect between us and the phenomenon. We bring something to the party and the phenomenon brings something to the party. And it's mysterious. So mutual enactment, I just mentioned that, this idea that, there's this co-creative process that occurs between ourselves and the phenomenon. And so we bring layers of distortion and interpretation, but that doesn't mean there still isn't something meaningful we can say about the phenomenon. We just have to do a little more work and effort to kind of discern the elements that we're bringing to it that are not helpful and the elements that are. Leaving Magonia. Right? Jay mentioned that one takeaway from his work with me is appreciating, the work that Jacques Vallée has brought to the UFO community in the late 60s around the interesting correlations between the fairy lore of medieval Europe and even contemporaneously with UFO reports and experiences and entity encounters. Well, I'm deeply indebted to Jacques Vallée for giving us a passport to get to Magonia. But I feel like he didn't give us the ticket to get out of Magonia, and so we've kind of been stuck there, right? And so there tends to be this way in which the fairy beings in our reality get reduced to the alien beings, or the alien beings get reduced to the fairy beings, and it's like, or they're both just a cultural frame for something else. My experience, both in terms of my direct experience and the research I've done, is that there are beings that are distinctly fairy in nature or elemental or nature spirits, and there are beings that are distinctly extraterrestrial or extra-dimensional. And so we need a more integrative comparative analysis that makes room for all of these complexities, including the fact that there's galactic fairies and Earth aliens, right? So then there's Pollak's brush, right? And this is in complementarity to Occam's razor, right? Where here we're making room for the explanatory power of more complex descriptions, right? The scientific impulse to try and trim it down to the most simplest explanation it's not only bad science, actually, but it also depends on the worldviews and assumptions as to what would be considered a more simple explanation, right? So Pollak's brush allows us to kind of open up and complexify the possibilities before we start trimming it down to its most simple elements. I mentioned the meta-integrative science of anomalous realities. There's this notion also that I developed around the Gordian taboo knot. And because I'm also very interested in, why is this topic so taboo? Why is it so hard to talk about anomalous experience in our society? And as I've studied it, I've realized that there are a lot of different layers. There's academic layers, scientific layers, sociological, religious, political, economic. So there's all these kind of interlocking elements that kind of mutually reinforce the taboo. And then lastly, imaginal vision or exosomatic cognition, right? This is this idea that our perception of anomalous phenomenon is often linked to our multiple subtle bodies and their associated inner senses. And this is going to be the area we focus on for my talk today. As I began kind of sharing more widely with my friends and colleagues about my anomalous experiences a number of years ago, I had this interesting experience where some of my closest friends started telling me about some of their anomalous experiences. And why this was so surprising was because I had known these people for 20-some years, and we had shared a lot of different experiences, meditative experiences, ayahuasca experiences, heartbreak, ups and downs. And yet, when they started sharing with me their anomalous experiences, because I was sharing about mine that had, were happening more recently, it just highlighted for me how taboo, even among good friends who are arguably sharing all kinds of experiences, still they're kind of keeping to themselves that really weird situation that happened. And so this picture is a placeholder for the story of one of my dear friends who told me one of his stories in this context where he said, one time I was living down by LA, and one night I heard, an owl outside the house, in the woods. It was just hooting, one owl. And then the next night there were two owls, and they seemed to be in the same tree. And I couldn't really see them because it was dark, but they were close enough that, I could hear them really clearly, and there were two. And he said, I thought that was odd. So then the third night, there were three owls. And then the fourth night, there were four owls. And then the fifth night, there were five owls. And he was very clear that he could tell there were distinctly five owls, and that each night there was more owls, right? And anyone familiar with Mike Cleland's work will kind of start to see some of the connections here. And then he said, and then a few days later, these blue beings showed up in my room in the middle of the night, and they did some healing work on me. And I was like, dude, why didn't you ever tell me this story before? This is incredible. Oh my gosh, this is so fascinating. And he's just like, I don't know. I just didn't think about it. I was just like, wow. So then another friend, this happened a couple months later, because I was sharing my anomalous experiences with everyone. I was like, oh my God, you got to hear this. And so people were so I started collecting other people's anomalous experiences. So then I have this friend in Iceland. And he's like, yeah, I've had a weird experience. I think I was even telling him about this other friend with the owls. He's like, yeah, I've had a weird owl experience. And I'd read Mike's book, and I was like, really? Tell me. I want to know. He says, yeah, he lives in Reykjavik, right? So the capital city. He says, in the middle of the night, I just woke up. I had this weird impulse to just go outside. Okay, ding, 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 ding. Already we're in the zone, right? He says, I go outside, and he lives in this kind of suburban neighborhood. And he goes out on the the front porch, and looking down the steps to the street, at his car, and on top of his car is a 4-foot owl. Now, one, Iceland doesn't really have owls. They're like some very small owls, but they're definitely not 4 foot in height. Nor do you typically see them in Reykjavik, in the city. Right? He said, there it is. There was this 4-foot owl standing on the top of my car looking at me. And I was just like, wow, like, why haven't you ever told me this? This is crazy. And then he keeps going on and he starts telling me about some blue beings that he's working with that show up, and he's been having a series of encounters with them. Right? And I'm just like going, okay, this is incredible. Right? So these continued to happen where people were sharing their, stories with me, and I just started to have this feeling of, wow, so many of us are having anomalous experiences. Like, it's just like ubiquitous. They're everywhere. And so, Jeff just came out with his book, The Superhumanities, and he's such a big inspiration for me. And I love this phrase he has in this book. He says, we have to decolonize reality itself, right? Like, we got to just open it up, right? And this is my whole point about reality is just weird, and it's dynamic, it's responsive, right? We have to decolonize it from the scientific materialistic frameworks we've used to try and understand it, because they're really not doing the job. And so he says here in this quote, graduate students have long been pushing me to teach, or better, to provide some sort of adequate historical and philosophical context for just these types of experiences, their own, i.e. their anomalous, extraordinary, paranormal, and superhuman experiences, basically like the ones that I just shared you for my two friends. They've been asking me to create some kind of institutional and conceptual framework for human abilities that are not supposed to exist, but clearly do. Basically, they want a new kind of school, a school of the superhumanities, one that is impossible within the epistemological frameworks and the ontological assumptions of the contemporary academy, right? So this quote speaks so deeply to me because I'm an academic, and I've dreamed about creating an integral program along these lines. Like, this is like one of my big, I want to do this in this lifetime. And so I want to make the invisible college visible, right? So this is one of my, kind of soul missions, if you will, right? So, making Hogwarts accessible. So a year ago, I launched this new program in integral noetic sciences. It's a graduate program, master's and PhD, where people can come and study and research the links between consciousness, reality, and UFOs, and everything that's weird, right? And so it allows students to work at the intellectual intersection of science, consciousness, embodiment, and weirdness. It engages students in advanced training and spiritual, esoteric, somatic, and contemplative practices, as well as, with subtle energies. We foster groundbreaking and edgy mixed methods research, so qualitative and quantitative methods to look at all of this. Cultivate global consciousness through grappling with these big questions like, are we alone? What's the nature of reality? What happens after we die? And then explore and pioneer new models of reality, right? Decolonize reality, right? So, and I have to think that Jeff's probably appreciative of me creating this program, and I've been in dialogue with him over the years about it, because I imagine all the people graduating from his program need a place to come and teach. So at the very least, they can come over and teach in my program. So Tim, that's an open invitation to talk with me later about that possibility. Within the program, there's an anomalous studies concentration, right? You could also think of this as exo studies, UFO studies, paranormal studies, weird studies. And it's really aimed to support graduate students to research the transformative potential of people's extraordinary anomalous experiences. And I had to kind of go to the wrestling mat with the board in order to have all of these words on the website. Paranormal, psi, multidimensional, galactic, esoteric, cryptozoological. They weren't happy about that one. Transpersonal, UFO, ET encounters. They weren't happy about that one either. And psychedelic, right? But they trusted me. They liked the general vision. They're like, okay, we'll support you in this. But it required kind of, a number of long conversations, shall we say. But, because there aren't a lot of places like this, right? Where you can go academically and engage this material experientially and really in a deep way. So we're also scientifically investigating through mixed methods, these anomalous realities and their relationship to consciousness and subtle energies. and exploring the ontological implications of anomalous experience and what it tells us about reality. Because every anomalous experience is like a window into the nature of reality, right? To me, it's like instead of throwing them away, we should be running towards them, because they're like windows. They're like these opportunities. It's like, wow, this can tell me something about reality. It can tell me something about myself. It can tell me about the relationship between my consciousness and reality. Like, what could not be more interesting than that, right? So let's start with talking about UFOs and the dead, okay? The dead just seem to show up everywhere. You know, Whitley Strieber, even in one of his early experiences, if I remember correctly, you know, had experience of a guy, and I don't even think he knew he had passed. He later found out he had passed. And he, you know, experienced this man being part of an encounter that he was having with the visitors, right? So, you know, and the dead just seem to be in a lot of these anomalous experiences. You know, in the fairy lore, they are also often in the encounters with fairy beings, right? So it's kind of like the the dead are just not that far away. As soon as we open the door to the other worlds, they seem to be there. And then we have Leslie Kean, who's here, right? And she's got 2 books. So her first, book, UFOs, it's nuts and bolts UFOs predominantly. As you know, a great book, really groundbreaking. And then her next book, Surviving Death, is like just totally went off the ranch and is talking about mediumship and survival of consciousness post, bodily death. And it's just kind of like, whoa, Leslie, what happened? You took a right turn. Like you went from UFOs to surviving death. Like, what's the connection? And she and I have talked about this a couple of times, and at a few points she said, I'm not sure. I'm not sure yet. Like I wrote them in really different modes, and they're just for, passion projects, and I'm not sure what the connection is. And I said, well, I think the third book you write has to like integrate and figure out and find out like what is the relationship between UFOs and the dead, right? So that's an integrative possibility for your next project, Leslie. If we look at the film Contact, right? Amazing film. I just rewatched it thanks to my wife. My wife's like, I want to watch Contact. I'm like, yes, let's watch Contact. And so we're watching it, and we get to this, iconic scene, right, where Jodie Foster as Ellie is, they've just dropped her. She's in this like metal ball that they've built, and this big machine that they've gotten these, blueprints from the Vegans through this, kind of radio signal. And they've figured out the blueprints, and they've built this machine. And they're basically, it's this kind of rotating torus thing, and it creates this energy vortex in the middle. And they have her in this little silver capsule, and they're going to drop it right at the right time, and it's going to go into kind of the vortex, and we don't know what's going to happen. And so she does that. She ends up having this experience where she's on this, pink beach with neon blue water. This being comes towards her, and she realizes it's her dad, who's passed. So here we have the dead, right? And then she's hugging him. And as she's hugging him, she realizes, you're not real, right? And then so basically she's realizing it's not her dad, it's actually the alien being. And he, in terms of it being her dad, in a sense, says, yeah, we thought it would be easier for you if I came in this form, right? So all of a sudden we're like, okay, where are we? What's happening? This is, is she dead? Is she alive? Is this a dream? Is she like gone through a wormhole to another dimension? Like, is it her dad? Like, it really looks like her dad. It, in a sense, feels like her dad, but isn't her dad, right? And so there's all these things. There's all this doubleness that's happening here, right? So again, we have UFOs and the dead, right? In this core iconic moment in Contact. And we have 3 major types of doubleness, right? I mentioned doubleness before, and here we have the doubleness with her in terms of, is she having a dream? Is it something that's happening inside? Or is it something that's happening in the external world in some sense, like on another planet, a beach on another planet? Is it, her dad? Is it a human? Is it an alien, right? Is she alive? Is she dead? The self, other, inside, outside, like all of this is mixed together. And then you have time and space all mixed up, right? Because it turns out when we come back after this event, it shows her kind of all squished up in the sphere that's fallen into the safety net at the bottom of this gyrating torus thing. And they are like, are you okay? Are you okay? She's like, yeah, how long was I gone? And they're like, what are you talking about? You're only gone for like 18 seconds. The ball just dropped through. Nothing happened. Nothing happened, Ellie. And she's like, no, I was gone for 18 hours, right? So here we have time and space, distortion. Her first-person experience was she was gone for 18 hours. She had a major experience. 18 hours worth of it. And they're saying, no, it's just like 18, 20, 25 seconds. And they look at the film, you can see you just drop through, straight through, nothing happened, right? So then we have what Kripal calls a flip. We have Ellie, who's the staunch-nosed scientist who will only accept things on an evidential basis, now has such a profound first-person anomalous experience that she can't deny, but she has no, quote, evidence for it. And then she's in like a Senate hearing where they're like grilling her and they're just like, where's your evidence? She's like, well, I don't have any, but it happened, right? And it's just such a powerful emotional moment, right? And I think it's partly why this scene just really touches us, because it has so many elements of doubleness that are so ubiquitous with anomalous experience. So UFOs, or trigger events open our psychic capacity, and it seems like the dead are there waiting. The dead are often around us, so when we activate our subtle senses, we often encounter them, because now, in a sense, we have eyes to see. We enter into the subtle realms and we pass through their zone, which overlaps in invisible ways with the zones of ETs and extra-dimensionals. The subtle realms are interpenetrating. They're not geospatially distributed in the ways they are here. And so when we shift our identity to our subtle bodies and their senses, modes of perception come online. And we can see the dead, the fae, ETs, celestial beings, and so forth. When we are in our subtle bodies, we're more likely to see the dead in their subtle bodies, right? Because we know that Jodie Foster, as Ellie, her body physically is in the metal sphere that's now in the safety net. So we know that's where her physical body is. But she's in an embodied state in this experience on this pink beach. So she's essentially in a subtle body of some sort, unless she's bilocated physically, which is also a possibility. And then so our soul and our subtle bodies and senses are a key link between UFOs and anomalous experience and the dead. And Jeff, I just can't help but keep coming back to Jeff because he's just so amazing. He has a chapter with Whitley Strieber in their co-authored book, The Supernatural, called The Soul is a UFO. Now there's a koan. And just meditate on that for a while. The soul is a UFO. I have one way of thinking about that, which I'm going to share in a moment. So it seems that there's all kinds of trigger events that allow us to differentiate our subtle bodies from our physical bodies. Physical, emotional, sexual abuse, this happens. Medical emergencies, physical trauma like a car accident or what happened with UJ. Anesthetics, and surgery, deep hypnotic trance, abduction events, UFO ET encounters, just visiting a paranormal hotspot, and I'll be talking about hotspots a little bit later, exposure to electromagnetic fields, esoteric and contemplative practices, and various contact modalities. So there's a lot of ways in which our subtle bodies get differentiated from our physical body, and it seems that when that happens, people start reporting more access to psychic abilities, paranormal experiences, anomalous realities. So there's something about when we are able to, in a sense, be in our subtle body in a way that's distinct from just unconsciously being in our physical body, that a whole new set of senses and modes of experience become available, or we start remembering those experiences more consciously. So there's a lot of different models of our subtle body system. This is one that I work with, Kurt Leland's neo-theosophical 9-body model, right? And so we can think of this as just one example of our multidimensional body. Physical body, etheric body, astral body, mental body, causal body, right? So if you look at that one right there, and I'm seeing this looks much prettier on my computer than it does here, but you still get the idea. it's really interesting that here we have the humanoid shape, right, kind of maintaining itself. And then with the causal body, which is often thought of as the soul, that's where the soul is, we basically have an orb, a plasma orb, right? The UFO and the soul, right? It's like, and we also have a lot of reports in the experiencer literature of orbs becoming beings and beings becoming orbs and craft becoming orbs and orbs becoming craft, right? So it's not to say that they're all like, a subtle body in this sense, but there seems like there's a link there. There's something interesting. There's a pattern. And then the bodies get smaller all the way to this, the nirvanic body, kind of this diamond shape. And then they explode out and it becomes basically a matrix of light that you're part of, right? So there isn't kind of like an individual body. And then you just become this big, glowing, conscious light ball, right? So different traditions have different ways of dividing this continuum. So if we think of the physical body on one end and kind of conscious light on the other end, you have Buddhism and Taoism and esoteric Christianity and Gnosticism and theosophical traditions. They basically are just dividing up this continuum in different ways, right? And this is where another student of J Kripal's, Simon Cox, came out with his dissertation as a book with Oxford Press in the last year or so. He develops a notion of multinatural somatic pluralism, meaning we have multiple real objective subtle bodies, right? And even though not all the subtle body models and systems are correlatable, they're still talking about real realities because these different traditions and their associated practices enact or co-create different subtle bodies, right? Even though there is a lot of referential overlap and similarities, you can have contradictory subtle body systems that are in fact ontologically real. And if we talk about the rainbow body, which is often kind of a word used to describe the ultimate subtle body state in these different traditions, you'll see that tons of traditions have some way of talking about the rainbow body. And this list is even longer. I just couldn't fit it on the slide. And again, it's not to say they're all talking about the same body. There are important differences between all of these various rainbow bodies. But it is to say something's going on here, right? That you wouldn't have all of these traditions working with the esoteric anatomy of the subtle bodies and describing them if there wasn't kind of a real ontological ground that they're tapping into. So just a quick tour of the senses that are associated with these different bodies. Physical body, obviously, our physical senses, waking consciousness. The etheric body tends to be associated with what's called second sight, right? A term from Scotland and often used there. Here is where you see auras, nature spirits, or elementals because they have etheric bodies. So when you're in your etheric body, you can see them in their etheric body, right? Here's where you tend to see the dead, human apparitions and ghosts and hauntings, because again, those tend to be etheric-bodied beings. You perceive power points, like in the land, recall experiences from the astral realm while awake. A lot of energy healing occurs in this body, so energy workers tend to shift into that body and then heal and work from that body. You can move physical objects in some cases. The phantom limb experience is an etheric body reality, and it's also our doppelganger because it looks exactly like us. So when a lot of the Indian saints are noted to bilocate, in many cases it's that they are showing up in their etheric body in a very vivid way somewhere, and it looks like they're there physically. Though that's not to say they might not be able to also be there physically in a bilocated state. Astral senses, right? So you tend to perceive humans in the initial phases of the afterlife zones, as well as the hell realms. Dream consciousness, so personal dreams are here. Astral entities or beings, including negative entities and angelic or celestial beings. Out-of-body experiences and astral travel are connected to this body. Near-death experiences often are connected to this body. Lucid dreams. Psychic development, such as telepathic and clairvoyant precognitive capacities, tend to be connected to this body by location. Seeing chakras and other subtle energy systems, and emotional telepathy. The mental senses that go with the mental body. Humans in the paradisial afterlife zones, where they're resting and recovering, as well as the heavens, the various heavens associated with the different religious traditions. The Library of Human Wisdom, and this is not the Akashic Records, that comes later, but it's kind of a similar kind of repository of human achievement in the arts and culture. We tend to connect with our guides and teachers in this body. A multi-perspective consciousness where you can like have 360 awareness, right? Where you can see in a 360 mode. Worldview and habitation, imagination, creation of thought forms occurs here. And then the source of psychosomatic experiences, such as the placebo effect, tend to be associated with this body, right? And then mental telepathy. The causal senses that come with the causal body are accessing the Akashic records, soul consciousness, simultaneous time, remembering past lives of oneself and others, afterlife training areas, becoming one with anything we see, the collected wisdom or essence of your prior lifetimes, so getting clear on your soul purpose, life between life recall for self and others, location of the I or the ego, or what the Tibetans call the indestructible drop. And the last one I'm going to cover here is the Buddhic senses that come with the Buddha body, unity consciousness, bliss, oneness with humanity and other life forms, higher self, the monad, which is usually thought of as being above the head, harmony, and source of inspiration for great works of art. Now, I'm not proposing that everything I've listed here is just like absolutely the case for all of these bodies, right? There's a lot of debate and difference between different multi-body systems and what senses or capacities are associated with them. More of what I'm trying to illustrate is that I think there's a creative way of drawing on these traditions and starting to understand that different bodies within our multi-subtle body system give us access to different types of anomalous experience. And we can begin to start to track and understand what are those relationships, right? So some of the things I've listed with the astral body might be available in the etheric body or the mental body and so forth, right? So I'm not trying to reify a particular set of relationships. I'm trying to open up our thinking to like going, oh, different people are having different kinds of anomalous experience. And it's very interesting when you have multi-witness events where one person sees one thing, another person sees that, but slightly different, and someone else sees something totally different. Might it be that different layers of their subtle body system are getting activated and different senses associated with those bodies are bringing online different modes of perception and knowing? So Kurt Leland has developed 20 different inner senses that he's developed out of the work of Seth, right? The channel material of Jane Roberts. And what's interesting about this is there's existential senses, so kind of dealing with your consciousness. There's kinesthetic senses dealing with moving in these different planes and realms. There's relational senses for interacting with different non-physical beings. And there's environmental senses of navigating the different landscapes and moving between landscapes, right? And so this basically is Ken Wilber's 4-quadrant map, for those of you familiar with integral theory. And Kurt is not aware of that map, but he still came up with these 20 senses that fit into that. And what this highlights for me is all 20 of these senses or similar kinds of distinctions of consciousness are working together to co-enact the phenomena and the anomalous experiences we're having in relationship to these beings or these realities, right? So there's many ways our consciousness is involved, both internally, externally, relationally, and environmentally. Anyone recognize that contact modality in the photograph? Now, a few heads shaking. So that's the device that Elliot created to help ET phone home, right? So he takes it out in the woods, and he's trying to, help bring the family back together. There are a lot of contact modalities. And as I've studied this, I've been amazed that pretty much everything is a contact modality, right? These are just a few of the kind of, well-known ones in this context, right? NDEs, OBEs, vision quest, dreams, and so forth, right? These are practices, methods, injunctions that we can do that put us in contact with anomalous realities, and often with non-human intelligences or alternate human intelligences, or dead people and so forth, right? So there's a lot of ways to break on through to the other side. right? In fact, it seems that given there's so many different kinds of contact modalities that we as humans are designed and very prone to make contact. Basically, anything that can shift our consciousness has the potential of putting us in contact, right? Even our cup of joe in the morning potentially has that capacity. And I'm always amazed because I've talked with long-term Theravadan Buddhist practitioners just doing basic insight meditation. And some of them in the context of that practice, which you would not associate with anomalous phenomenon so much, start having gray show up in their meditations. And they're like, what's going on? Like, where did this come from? And then they go to their teacher, and their teacher's like, just ignore it. Just go back to the breath. Go back to the breath, right? And my whole point is no, don't go back to the breath. Talk to it, ask, why is it here? What's going on, right? There's this tendency in our traditions to, disregard, dismiss, to minimize, to talk shit about subtle realm phenomena and experiences because it's a distraction from waking up. Are you kidding me? This is not a distraction from waking up. This is waking up. This is waking up to the multidimensional reality that we are part of. So why is it our religious and contemplative traditions are so anti-subtle? All right, I'm stepping off my soapbox, but thank you for that validation. These other beings are real, right? That's what that whole article that Jay mentioned and I showed you at the beginning is about. It's but how do we talk about that? What does that mean? Because they're not necessarily real in the ways we think of real, but they are real. They're ontologically real. At least that's the case I make. And it's interesting because some beings show up across all those contact modalities, right? Greys and reptilians and mantid beings all have, I've come across examples of all of those beings showing up across all of those contact modalities. That's interesting. What is it about those beings in particular that enables them, whatever they are, to basically be very accessible, kind of no matter what kind of contact modality we're working with? Now, that's not to say, there's a lot of people who do dance their whole life and they don't have an experience of a mantid being, right? So don't get me wrong. But the point is there are enough descriptions of people who have been in a deep dance, kind of ecstatic mode, and then said, holy smokes, all of a sudden I was dancing with a mantid being, where'd that come from, right? And then there's, other forms like DMT, where there's certain kinds of beings that only seem to show up with DMT, right? The machine elves and so forth, right? So some beings seem to be contact modality dependent, whereas other beings are not, right? And so that's a whole interesting set of considerations. So this is a diagram where I try and, kind of in a very mental, conceptual way, try and point to this mutual enactment, right? So what we have going on here is the who, the how, and the what, right? So who we are, what we do, what practices we do, the modalities plays a role with what we encounter, right? As well as, and it works both ways. The what informs the how, which informs the who, right? So mutual enactment means the directions of causality are in all directions, right? But we often think of it as I have certain bodies, they have certain senses or modes of knowing, I take up certain practices, that takes me to certain domains, and then in those domains, I encounter different types of beings, right? So that would be a very linear way of thinking about it. That's an accurate way of thinking about it, but I want to suggest that the causality is more dynamic and it works in all directions. But this at least helps us tease apart what I'm suggesting, that we are in a very participatory dance with anomalous realities. And if we only study, and some people only study the types of beings we interact with, or some just talk about all the planes or realms, some just talk about contact modalities, and then others are talking about these. I want to bring them all to the paranormal party and say, okay, what happens when we start working with subject matter experts in all of these areas and start trying to understand the dynamics at play and how this co-creative process is occurring? So one of the models I use a lot is Ken Wilber's 4 quadrants. It's one of the meta theory frameworks, which basically says these 4 dimensions co-arise together. Our subjective internal experience, our objective behaviors and body, the systems that we're part of and environments we're part of, and our culture and relational dimensions, and that all of this co-arises together. So it's just another example of this kind of mutual enactment. So then if we kind of bring that frame back to this, right? So we have the experiencer, and I mentioned these 4 categories of inner senses, that they're mutually enacting and supportive of one another. And then the phenomenon has 4 major dimensions. It's observable, there's experiential aspects, cultural aspects, social and systems aspects, right? So there's a relationship between our inner senses in these 4 dimensions and the phenomenon in its 4 dimensions, as kind of simplified in how it's presented here, the who, which is us, and the phenomenon, which is, these anomalous realities. So I'm trying to explore and understand what is the dance between us and the realities, right? And how do we understand that? In my ongoing research, experientially, talking with experiencers, I spend a lot of time talking to experiencers because I think they just have so much to offer us, and I'm so supportive of JAU and Kirsten and Stuart and what you're doing with the experiencer group. We need safe places for experiencers to talk about their experiences, or just people to talk about their anomalous experiences. When I study that and I talk to those people and I read the literature, I find a few patterns, right? And so these are the patterns I've come across in terms of the phenomenon and in terms of the experiencer. Let me start with the phenomenon. The phenomenon almost always seems to have these 4 core elements, and they link up to the quadrants we were looking at before. Light and energy almost always seems to be present in one way or another at some point in the process. Intelligent and imaginal. Imaginal meaning not only is it intelligent, but it's kind of imaginary. It's dynamic. It's dreamlike. It's it's just kind of got archetypal qualities and things like that. But it's also intelligent. There's a quality of sentience there. So light and energy and intelligence, and then there's this trickstering and tailored aspect. It's like it knows you better than you know yourself. It's one step ahead of you. It's it's tailoring the experience for you, which makes you feel like you're going crazy and what's going on. Synchronicities often are part of this, and that's where time and space come in. There's these distortions of time and space, or what we call distortions from our kind of normal waking consciousness sense of consensus reality. They're probably not distortions. This is the distortion, right? This, rational waking mode of consciousness is the distortion, right? So the phenomenon seems to have these 4 components over and over again. Certain experiences or events might emphasize 1 or 2 of them more. Sometimes one of them might be entirely absent, but over and over again, I see all 4 showing up. When it comes to the experience of the phenomenon, right? When we as individuals, as human beings, experience anomalous phenomenon that has these elements, there can be healing and harm that occurs to the physical body. So there's a physiological dimension. There's a potency, right? A psychological and psychic potency. It's very meaningful. It might be very confusing. It could be traumatic. It could be very life-altering. Stuart Davis had a 60-second encounter with a mantid being on New Year's Eve in a fever state, right? And we could just say, oh, that's a hallucination for sure. But then he has spent the 10-plus years since then, basically every piece of artwork or music that he's done has been a response to that 60-second encounter. Often, our experience of the anomalous go deeply in. They change our lives. There's a potency to them that we can't deny. And that in itself is a very interesting aspect of the phenomenon. So then, and also our psychic abilities often come online in different ways, right? With the composite example I opened with. Participatory, I've been talking about that. Perplexing, right? The Oz factor, everything goes silent, synchronicities, right? So the experiencer often is perplexed. There's some deep participatory dynamic. There's a quality of potency, and often there can be a physiological element. So I want to talk about 2 super experiencers, right? Let's just bring it home, baby. Let's talk about a good example of what all this looks like. So Dr. Melinda Greer, she's in the last couple of years been sharing her stories. She has a chapter in Ray Hernandez's new book, A Greater Reality, and has a few interviews online. I knowing a bit about her story, I reached out to her, got in touch with her, and chatted with her, really lovely woman. And I said, at the end of the conversation, I said, would you mind, I want to send you an email with a bunch of questions about your experience. And I know the answer to many of them because I've seen your interview, I've read your chapter, but I just wanted you to just review this and let me know which of these items have you experienced, okay? So the ones in red are the ones she has not experienced. The ones in blue are the ones she has. So let's quickly look at this. She's had 3 UFO sightings. She thinks she might have had some ET contact, but not sure. She has had strange entities, energy beings, during her NDE. She's had 3 really clear Bigfoot sightings over many years. She's had encounters with ghosts. She's a doctor. She's just recently retired. When she was walking around the hospital on 3 or 4 different occasions, she saw dead people, often thinking they were patients, until either she noticed they didn't have legs and were just kind of hovering there, or she turned around and then they were just instantly gone, right? And then she's had poltergeist activity. She's had the experience of apports, things disappearing and moving or showing up in other places. Psi capacities activated. She's had near-death experiences. She had one when she was very young, and then another one when she was older, and I think she maybe even 3, I'm not remembering, but multiple near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, missing time, powerful dreams, teaching dreams, and being taught in the dreams, weird smells, weird sounds, healings that she's experienced, the Oz factor, multiple witnesses to a number of her episodes, capacity to heal others, possibly, she says, telepathy, downloads, mystical experiences of unity and or love. Now, what's amazing about this was just an informal list of, hey, have you had this experience? And this is what I got back. Like, there's like so many follow-up questions I have. Melinda, tell me about this, tell me about that. Like, oh my gosh, right? So there's so much more there for her to share with us, right? So here's a person who's just had such a wide range of experiences. So why is that? Why is she having such a wide range? Is it related to the near-death experience she had when she was little and then again later? And do some of these experiences amplify and make available more of these kinds of experiences? Like, how does all of this work? All right, so that's Dr. Melinda Greer. And she's not related to the infamous Stephen Greer. Same last name, both doctors, not related. All right, so then super experiencer, Mr. Chris Bledsoe. I just got a new video from him on my cell phone just like 10 minutes before I came on. He's like, Sean, you got to look at this. It's like this incredible video footage. He's talking with John Alexander on the phone, and he's filming it. And it's like these orbs, 3 orbs, and they're just like, it's amazing footage, right? So I met Chris at the Moreau Institute at an event that I was at earlier this year where Mr. Exo Academian was at as well, who's here with us today. And so I was like, Chris, I'm going to send you an email with all these questions. Tell me which ones you've experienced. And I know his story too. I know he's like off the charts, right? Only one did he not experience, body marks, right? So he exhausted my list, which means there must be another 20 I haven't asked him that he would say yes, no, or maybe to. Right? So again, it's just this indication of like, I got my work cut out for me. Like, I got to just keep finding out what are the questions to ask to find out what's the full range of anomalous experiences that you've had, right? So I'm not going to go through it all, but all the red ones with Dr. Greer are now blue, right? So it's just incredible that one person would have all of this, and he's not alone. There are a lot of super experiencers out there. There's a lot of people who have this wide range. And all of this basically started with his 2007 event, a trigger event, right? So what is it about these trigger events, whether it's an NDE when we're little or a UFO ET encounter when we're a grown adult, that then seems to like activate, and again, I'm not trying to reduce everything to the subtle bodies because I know there's a lot more going on. But in this talk, I'm just trying to emphasize that as a very viable consideration of one layer of what's happening, right? And with those different subtle body activations, different types of senses, different capacities to experience different types of beings and different types of realities. So then I was looking at that, well, I go back. I'm like, wow, this is Chris Bledsoe, right? And this is Melinda Greer. they sound like Skinwalker Ranch. They sound like a personified experience of Skinwalker Ranch. Like Skinwalker Ranch has all this crazy stuff happening. Like, so what's the relationship between a place like that and people like this? So then I'm like, all right, I want to take a closer look at paranormal hotspots or super hotspots. And because some paranormal spots are known for like, oh, this is a hotspot for Bigfoot. This is a hotspot for dead people, ghosts, and deceased. This is a hotspot for, UFO sightings. So just like people, some hotspots kind of are specialized in certain types of anomalous experience. And then there's super hotspots that just are wild. They have all of this stuff going on, right? So I've stolen this slide, though I'm giving credit, to Paul Eno and his son, who basically had a version of this up in a talk that they gave. And this is what they have found occurs in super hotspots in their research of working directly with a number of super hotspots, right? So UFOs, things come and go via holes in the sky, right? Apportation of objects and animals, sometimes even people, cryptids, Bigfoot, alien encounters, gracing in the homes, parasite, which means negative entities, poltergeist activities, slips in time-space, ghosts, giant birds, heightened psychic abilities, waking visions, and vivid dreams. So again, that doubleness. Then military activity throughout the area. This is very interesting, and they talk about how the paranormal is being weaponized by either military or paramilitary groups, Men in Black, mass changes in behavior, electronic voice phenomena, Mandela effect, animal mutilations, people encountering different versions of themselves or others. That's weird. Often overlaps with sacred native lands, often modern cold activity occurring in those areas. So then I did more research. I'm like, okay, that's what a super hot spot looks like, right? Where there's just a ton of anomalous experiences happening. So then where in the US are these super hot spots? Well, here they are, right? There's, 13, 14 of them, right? A number of famous triangles, Bridgewater triangles nearby, Skinwalker Ranch, Mount Shasta, the Ascetti Ranch and the whole kind of triangle by Mount Rainier, Mount Adams, and Mount St. Helens, right? So I'm like, all right, here are the paranormal hotspots. Like, that's interesting. This reminds me of David Pilati's cluster map of 411 missing. Well, let's take a look. So then I put together this map. He put it together. I just kind of brought it into this context. And then I'm looking at the profile points. Okay, these are examples of people who go missing and generally are never found, or if they are found, they're found under very weird circumstances. I'm not going to go through all the profile points right now, but I want to bring your attention to a few of them. Close to water, close to large granite formations, felt unwell before disappearing, sudden bad weather. Okay, I might be reaching here, but this is how we get the conversation going, right? This is how we start to consider, how do we connect the dots? So I'm reading all of that, and I'm looking at those 4 items, and I'm thinking, all right, I know that in the poltergeist literature, it's not uncommon for major infestations of poltergeists in houses where there's a lot of anomalous activity happening, for that house to be near 2 bodies of water, like 2 streams or rivers that cross, or to have underground water crossing, right? What's interesting about that is a lot of our sacred sites in native lands and in Europe are built on places where there's underground water crossing, right? Because it creates an ionic dynamic that then supports a thin veil between worlds, right? So if that's happening with our sacred sites, that's happening with poltergeist activity, and maybe that's part of what's happening with these disappearances in the 411 literature, that there's something going on here. So then I overlaid I went back to the hotspots and asked, do any of these super hotspots of anomalous activity, do they overlap with the 411? And yeah, about half of them do, okay? And then interestingly, David's coming out with a new film, the connection between the 411 and the UFOs. So 2 more slides, and then I'm wrapping it up. And I got the signal from Jay. Thank you, Jay. So 2 things that I'm doing with all of this. I'm, in the new year, launching a extraordinary experience and entity encounter global research project, right? Where I want to get, and this is inspired by the free research, inspired by the Finders research that Jeffrey Martin has done, inspired by the research Gary Nolan and Kit Green have done, where I want to do 5,000 global surveys of anomalous experience. Then from that, select 100 people for in-depth interviews and psychometric assessments and clinical engagement. And then from that, do 50 brain scans and 50 subtle energy assessments to try and understand how might we better, make sense of some of these patterns and connections. So in the spring, I'm going to have host a entity encounter symposium because I find this to be one of the most interesting aspects of anomalous experience, where we're going to have experts, familiar with different types of entities come and share with us their experience as well as their expertise. So with that, I leave you with this comic. I'm not allowed to read it because my kids are watching, but I think it's an interesting perspective to take. So with that, thank you so much.